Welcome everybody. My name is Tim Cresswell and I'm the Associate Director of the Humanities Center. The Humanities Center Director, as I'm sure most of you know, sorry, that's over there. Every year we have a fellowship, kind of fellowship of the rings kind of thing, a fellowship where we have a theme and we get members of faculty and graduate students from across the humanities, social sciences and beyond to take part in a series of meetings which happen mostly every other week, where we are either reading around a theme from work from as well established outside of Northeastern, or later on in the series reading each other's work to sort of workshop what's going on. Now last year, many of you will know, we talked about viruses and virology and the viral, and this year our theme has been space and place. And I just wanted to, and so part of the process, as well as what I just described, is a series of presentations by the fellows who are sitting in front of you now, and we'll introduce to you later as we go through them. This is the first of those. Originally we were going to have two people maybe from this motley crew talk to you about their particular work in relation to space and place. But we decided rather than do that, we would allow people to develop their ideas more, so those events will happen later, and I think you have a program of those or something resembling that on your chairs. And instead start by a kind of a round table discussion, conversation about space and place, when people are at the beginning stages, probably not of thinking about space and place in its entirety, otherwise they wouldn't be fellows, but in thinking about it in this interdisciplinary framework. So the point of today is for these individuals to talk very briefly about space and place in their work and inspire you all to think about it yourselves. But I wanted to start, I just decided to do this really today, so I apologise for those of you who haven't told. But just to talk a little bit, maybe for 5 minutes of my own, about the general theme to get us going. And that's what I'm going to do. So this year's fellows are exploring the theme of space and place in an interdisciplinary context. To me, this represents an exciting opportunity to start a conversation across disciplines at an opportune moment. Across the humanities and social sciences, we are experiencing a flourishing of work that takes spatiality seriously. Space and place have often been seen as either a setting for other, more important processes in culture and society in which they take place, or alternatively, as the outcome of these more important processes, a kind of end product. A series of developments both within disciplines and across disciplines have changed this in fundamental ways. So first of all, we have seen what is called the spatial turn across the humanities and social sciences. This refers to a general recognition that social and cultural life do not happen on the head of a pin, but are thoroughly spatial. The spatial turn made its presence felt, for instance, in the study of literature, where space and place had been too often relegated to mere setting, the least active or interesting component in the assemblage of literary texts. Pioneering work by scholars such as Raymond Williams and Edward Said placed the geography of literature at the centre of our understanding of the relationship between text and context, in ways that enlivened rather than deadened our reading of both the canon and an increasing array of texts that had previously been marginalised within literary studies. In history, we saw the emergence of spatial history, where the magisterial work of Richard White, and particularly Paul Carter's Road to Botany Bay, subtitled An Essay in Spatial History. Feminist scholars such as Elizabeth Gross and Iris Marion Young wove space and place into their accounts of the construction of masculine worlds and their radical alternatives. The spatial turn was given a significant boost when Michel Foucault, whose work on prisons, the asylum and the clinic were all radically spatial in nature, became an evangelist for the importance of space in an essay published in 1984. And this is an extract from that. The great obsession of the 19th century was, as we know, history, with its themes of development and of suspension, of crisis and cycle. Themes of the ever-accumulating past with its great preponderance of dead men and the menacing glaciation of the world. The present epoch will perhaps be above all the epoch of space. We are in an epoch of simultaneity. We are in the epoch of juxtaposition, the epoch of the near and far, of the side-by-side, of the dispersed. We are at the moment, I believe, when our experience of the world is less that of a long life developing through time than that of a network that connects points and intersects with its own scheme. Soon, space was everywhere. Sociologists and anthropologists, aware of course of their inheritance in the works of the Chicago School of Sociology and the ethnic methodology of Irving Goffman on the one hand, and the anthropology of Levi-Strauss on the other, experienced a renewed interest in the way space works its ways into the crevices of social and cultural processes as an active agent in the production, maintenance, and transformation of everyday life. Even the more scientific ends of social science, which had long been set on arriving at law-like universal generalizations for human behavior, began to recognize that the space in which social things happen is neither the mythical isotropic plane of many models, nor the head of a pin danced on by angels. Forms of spatial modeling became more sophisticated, starting with cluster analysis and moving on to a general recognition of the importance of place and spatial variation. Space and place have had their presence felt across all the central research themes of this university. In health research, there's been increasing interest in the role of space and environment in realms ranging from the current vogue field of epigenetics, in which places impact directly on the very genetic makeup of our bodies, to the roles of place and landscape in the treatment of illness, in so-called therapeutic landscapes. In the arena of security studies, we have seen everything from the problematic impact of the so-called broken windows theory of criminal and deviant behaviour to the development of pattern of life analysis that allows drone operators to assess the likely guilt of people at a distance by recording their movements in space and over time. Much of this I find deeply troubling, but it is also spatial theorists, inspired by Foucault, of course, who are revealing the way space is being used by the security state to impinge on any remaining remnants of truly public space we have left in the city. Either way, space and place are at the centre of debates, and sustainability is possibly the easiest of the three themes to make a spatial case for. The recent recognition of the Anthropocene as a geological era in which humans are the main actors has led to a lively debate about the kinds of places we want to live in, and what we want future generations to live in. Sustainability is about the key issue of how we dwell in the world. It's a question of place. While the spatial turn is now 30 years old, a new ingredient has recently been added, the digital humanities, which combine a level of technical expertise in the handling of large, even big data sets, with sophisticated spatial analysis and representation through geographical information systems, or GIS. The recent embrace of GIS and other digital tools by the traditionally technologically adverse disciplines of English and history, who are leading the way here, by the way, is connected to the theoretical recognition of the importance of spatiality. In addition, the sudden explosion in geocoded data, thanks to the mobile devices we all carry in our pockets, is allowing raw realms of social scientific analysis right down to the level of the individual to open up. Some of this is troubling and linked to issues of surveillance and the corporatization of everyday life, but there are also new creative possibilities for using information that always comes with longitude and latitude. Forms of counter-mapping and critical spatial science are possible. Creative artists have been among the first to become aware of the potential of locative media and geocoded data in raising questions about the role that space and place play in our everyday lives. Final paragraph. So this combination of influences across the disciplines, linking the humanities, the social sciences, and the creative arts, have led to what has recently been called the GeoHumanities, a new interdisciplinary endeavour with space and place at its heart that links decades of critical thought following the spatial turn to new developments in our digital capabilities. It is in this context that this year's Fellows scheme in the Humanities Center has been planned, and today we are lucky enough to have 8 short presentations on the importance of space and place by 6 faculty and 2 graduate fellows from across the disciplines, from within humanities and social sciences and one from without, to kick off this year-long conversation. So now what we're going to have are our 8 fellows, and they've been assigned 5 minutes, which I know I've been a bit greedy and taken a little bit more than that, 5 minutes each to introduce different ways, these will all be radically different, I imagine, ways in which space and place impinge on their own work or their discipline's work. And they all each have an overhead to illustrate that, and hopefully they're all connected to this. There we go. So that's their bit. So we're going to start with Len Albright, Assistant Professor of Sociology. I think we're just going to stay sitting down and do this, or yeah, okay, thanks.
Actually, mind if I stand? I'm like I move a lot.
Looking at the wrong person.
Okay, so I'm like one of those, like the body starts moving and the ideas start flowing.
One of my favorite diagrams.
So thanks, Tim. My name is Len Albright. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Public Policy. My training is as a sociologist. I was first introduced to this idea of place when I read Tim's book as an undergrad, Place, A Short Introduction. And my mind blew, and I was like, oh, place, really interesting, but I didn't quite get it. And then I was in grad school, and I was taking a course with Saskia Sassen, who's a sociologist. She writes about global cities. And she started this class. She has a wonderful way of kind of making up words to get at her point. And she started this class talking about the thingness of spatiality. And I wrote down thingness of spatiality, and then my brain kind of like disappeared. And then she ended the class, and I didn't hear a word that she said. And I looked back at my paper, and all I had written down was thingness of spatiality. And I was like, what? What exactly are we talking about? So, over the last 10 years, I've tried to kind of get a grasp of what is space, what is place, how does this tie into the kind of central questions that we're concerned with as sociologists. So today I'm going to talk about kind of 3 of the central problems that sociologists have been interested in, and then 3 kind of humanities themes that this ties into. And I'm going to use this neat magnet kind of drawing to kind of get at it. So this is have people seen this drawing before, or maybe some? So this was a guy named Ebenezer Howard. He was an early urban planner, late 1800s, early 1900s in England. And he was interested in suburbs. He kind of saw, cities as this kind of giant, chaotic mess in which people were climbing on top of each other, and capitalism was oppressing people, and it was, keeping the working class down. But he also saw the country as kind of having some problems. He said, the country was beautiful. It's gorgeous. You can enjoy some migrating warblers in the spring, but there was this lack of society. There wasn't people to kind of advance ideas and kind of push knowledge. It's bad to trespass. You cross someone's land, that's pretty bad. But there's beautiful sunshine, but there's a lack of amusement. There's no public spirit. There's this lack of drainage that is just oppressive. In these heavy rains, you're up to your knees in muck. But he was looking at this issue, this kind of this tension between, you move to a city, right? There's amazing ideas, there's subcultures that can blossom. But in the country, you have this kind of peace of mind and this kind of natural connection, but it lacks some of that sophistication that we can develop with all this coordination in the city. I'm sorry, in here. So he posed this idea of the town country. This is the suburb, and he thought that this would be the best of both worlds, right? You could have the beauty of nature, but there's also enough people that you can move, right? There's opportunity, there's other people. You have low rents. You also have no sweating, so that's great. So affordable living, you can wear whatever you want any time of year. The suburb sounds like a dream place. And I really love this because it's this idea of these magnets that are pulling on space, right? And it says, where will they go? Where will people go, right? And to me, this gets at these 3 central problems of sociology. So in sociology over the last 100 years, some of the things that we've been interested in, coordination. And this is the Durkheimian perspective, right? We have gazillions of people all over the place. How do we get anything done? How do we develop knowledge systems? How do we develop institutions like an economy? How do we divide labor in a way that we can get work done? So coordination is a big thing. Meaning is another issue in our lives. This is the Weberian tradition. We're doing all this stuff. How does this mean anything to me? Hopefully when I die, I kind of look at my ledger and I say, I had a meaningful life. It was pretty good. But we've been interested in how do we develop meaning in our lives? How do we give meaning to other people? How do we transmit this across generations? And then the third central question is around power. This is about the distribution of resources. This is the kind of Marxist perspective, the feminist critique, critical race theory. How does something like space become a basis for distributing resources? Why is it that some of us have more than others? Why is it that some groups of people have more than others? So these 3 things have kind of animated a lot of the questions in sociology over the last 100 years. Coordination, meaning, and power, right? So we need to get stuff done. It needs to be meaningful in some way. And ideally, we're sharing the work and we're sharing the kind of fruits of our work. So, now take that in the context of something like this. So we live in a city. We're trying to coordinate all kinds of stuff. We need to make sure that, I can get to work, so I need to make sure that the bus is there at 8 o'clock every day. and I need to make sure that the power is on. I have no clue how the electricians do this. I still think electricity is like alchemy, right? There's people that are experts at that, they do that. And my job is just to show up and teach, and the students are here and they're fed. Incredible coordination. There's meaning happening in cities, right? These are places that we go to a beautiful concert in the park, and it's lovely, and it makes us reflect on our lives. Oh, life is meaningful, it's good, right? And then there's also power. Cities have incredible amounts of opportunity, but they also present all these types of issues. We have to coordinate all this kinds of work. We have to navigate complex systems. So, central issue of sociology: coordination, meaning, and power. How does this tie into GeoHumanities, right? How does space and place get into this? So we think about, okay, let's boil this down to some human issues, right? Things I'm most interested in are mobility, inequality, and social change. And these are our human dramas, right? We all want to strive. We want to know more. We want to go different places. We want our kids to do better than we're doing. These are the issues of mobility. But how do we coordinate mobility? How is it meaningful? How does power tie into that, right? Because we don't all have equal access to being mobile. Some people, families continue to be trapped in poverty. Other families are making the American dream happen so quickly. Well, how is that distributed? Inequality is another human theme. What is it like to live next to a neighbor who has a lot more than you, or a lot less? What is that human drama there? How does this translate when we think about a GeoHumanities, where we have entire nations of people that have much less or more than other groups of people? And finally, this issue of social change. We're humans, right? We're incredibly dynamic. That's what makes being a human exciting. We want to understand that, but it takes a lot of coordination. Sometimes social change happens with a lot of, it might be about crisis, it might be about power being exerted in certain ways, and it's always quite meaningful, right? I think that these kind of change moments in our lives, whether it's a wedding or a death or a new job, this is when you kind of take your breath and say, wow, life is pretty amazing. It's pretty great, right? So that's kind of where I'm going to stop, and I'll just to reiterate, coordination, meaning, and power, kind of central questions, and to get into these ideas of mobility, inequality, social change. Sociology tries to explore those and tries to add into that conversation in some way that makes this human experience more legible and more interesting to all of us in different fields. So thanks for your time.
Thanks. Our next speaker is one of our graduate fellows. Very happy to have her on board, Emily Artiano, who is in the Department of English and Much Literature. So there's something completely different, which is what I think will happen for the next few minutes. There we go. Oh, I did too. My mistake. What's going on? There we go.
Thank you.
Don't spoil anyone's surprises.
Thank you to the Humanities Center, to Lori Lexitz, Tim Cresswell, and everyone for being here. My images aren't so much, they're more implicitly related to what I'm going to be talking about, so just something for your viewing pleasure, and I can talk about it later when we have more time. So I'm going to speak about the spatial turn and I'm going to speak about how the spatial turn in the humanities has informed my field of specialization, which is early American literature, and my project, which explores linguistic diversity in colonial and early national texts. Questions of space and place have guided many studies in early American literature, which is typically considered text produced from the colonial period till the end of the Civil War. For example, Martin Bruckner has argued that geographic literacy in the 18th century, which by that he means facility with maps and cartography handbooks, has emerged in literature, influenced American identity formation. Other early American studies consider how literature reflected Native American claims to space and the question of geography in the slave narrative. New exciting work, which Tim referred to, has been happening right here at Northeastern in the Digital Humanities projects. For example, Ryan Cordell's viral texts that consider space in terms of material circulation and place in terms of sites of text consumption. In the last 25 years, literary scholars have become increasingly attentive to the mutually constitutive nature of literature in Europe and the Americas, and thus scholarship shifted spatially from a national framework, which has historically been used to define literary fields, to a transatlantic paradigm. My project is interested in the multidirectional influences this paradigm offers in relation to language, and explores the way linguistic negotiations in literature represented, articulated, and produced understandings and identities of space and place and their occupants. Colonial and early national America is ripe for an examination of representations and productions of space and place, particularly because of colonists' fraught relationship to homes, settlements, and peoples. The standing narrative that my work engages and pushes on is as follows. In the 17th and 18th centuries, British colonists in North America were thousands of miles away from the metropole, the place they considered home. One way these colonists continued to identify themselves as British, despite the distance from their homeland, was through the English language, in contrast to the languages of natives, colonials from other European powers, and Africans brought to the Americas through the brutal transatlantic slave trade. The strong association between place, language, and identity is in fact what produced interest in the standardized English language. Such standardization was made possible through print, and a standard English language became a cornerstone of national consciousness. When place no longer served as a stable category for English identity, language began to function as a premier symbol of national identity and the fundamental claim to a national place, and the British colonials in turn imposed English, namely on Native Americans and Africans. In the early national moment, language became a central component of national identity in the new United States, where the de facto national language was American English. As the project of imperialism became redefined as a national project, the bodies of educated white men became associated with the national language. American English was mapped onto these Anglo-American bodies as a means of carving out a unified space for American identity. Now, the former colonists needed to establish and maintain a unified identity separate from the British. Again, one's physical location did not constitute national identity. Rather, mastery of American English represented a claim to American identity. One's location in a physical territory, then, was not enough to ensure her placial belonging. But the polyglot reality of the lived bodies in this space required linguistic negotiations that helped to produce and constitute this new place. What does the story of space, place, and language in early America have to do with literature? Literature reflects, complicates, and unsettles the narrative I just recounted. Rather than purporting a unidirectional story of conquering space and cohering place through language, my project seeks to make visible the nuances of linguistic colonization and the multidirectional influences of language through literature. Literary narratives, I suggest, reflect and produce the meeting up of histories, to borrow Doreen Massey's term, which we all read together, rather than the conquest of space. Non-native English speakers played a major role in Anglophone texts, both as characters and as authors in early America. I analyzed the linguistic exchanges and works of colonial writers such as Mary Rowlandson, the Puritan captive of Native Americans turned author, the works of early national non-native English-speaking authors such as Samson Occam and Phyllis Wheatley, the first Native American man and the first African American woman, respectively, to publish writings in English, and the works of antebellum authors such as Herman Melville. Focusing on dynamic linguistic exchanges in this literature offers new possibilities and a fuller picture for understanding how space and place were conceived, represented, and constituted in early America. This fuller picture also relies on a largely interdisciplinary approach, and I draw from several fields. For example, I use rhetoric and composition theories concerning translingualism and code meshing in my scholarship to account for rhetorical authority garnered or ceded by writers working in multiple languages. Readings and discussions of the geographic turn in humanistic studies in the Humanities Center this year continue to inform my sense of the need to understand linguistic exchange in literature as a temporally, spatially, and placially situated act.
Thanks, everyone. So our next speaker is James Connolly, who's an assistant professor of political science and public policy.
Hello, good afternoon. So as Tim said, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science as well as the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. My PhD, so academic training, is in urban planning. So via the urban, sort of space and place is kind of built into just about everything that I'm thinking about. However, my research focuses mostly on the political geographic challenges of urban sustainability. What I wanted to do is sort of dig through some of the issues that are important to me via one specific example that you're looking at here, and then talk about where that takes me in terms of my own research. But the field of urban planning is sometimes, in fact, described as the art of placemaking. But I would say that this is actually a very imprecise description of the field, because what it does not do is talk about whose definition of place we are in fact trying to make. And that, I would say, is at the heart of sort of urban politics and urban planning and policy. So I want to present the issue that the politics of place is, I would argue, fundamental to efforts to make cities more environmentally sound. And one example of this can be found in the story of what is called the Green Dot Map from the city of New Orleans. And that's what you're looking at here as my image. So in the months following Hurricane Katrina, the environmental history of New Orleans became a topic of central concern for many people. The vulnerability of the always vulnerable low-lying areas in the city had clearly increased. People pointed to factors like the slow degradation of barrier wetlands in the Mississippi Delta, resulting from land reclamation, urban redevelopment, and agricultural runoff. And they also pointed to the increased intensity and frequency of storms resulting from climate change. And bringing together these two processes of urban environmental history in New Orleans as well as climate change, people started to argue that the course of development in the city of New Orleans was no longer sustainable, and that New Orleans needed a plan for resilience given these new environmental conditions. And that was really the immediate context of the sort of post-Katrina planning within New Orleans, was a focus on this need for greater resilience and sustainability in the city. So as with all disasters in cities, and specifically because Hurricane Katrina comprised a major disruption of place in the city of New Orleans, this represented in the eyes of many an opportunity to rethink what place meant in New Orleans, and to essentially reimagine the city of New Orleans. So one group among the many people that were interested in reimagining New Orleans was a set of, I would argue, more or less well-meaning urban environmental planners who wanted to address these issues of sustainability and resilience. That was their key focus. And they set about, within the immediate months after Hurricane Katrina, to develop a set of recommendations that were linked to the work of a commission known as the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, which was commissioned by the Urban Land Institute, which is a professional organization representing urban developers. It was mostly a commission populated by sort of elites and development elites specifically in the city. But there were urban environmental planners working behind the scenes to develop this plan, and they were focused on sustainability and resilience, essentially. So the result of the plan was what came to be known as the Green Dot Map, and that's what you're looking at here. So this map appeared, it was the first result of the process that was released to the public. It appeared on the front page of the Times-Picayune, the major paper in New Orleans. With the paper, as well as a number of other elites in the city, endorsed the plan, saying it was the right way for New Orleans to go. And what it did, and what you're looking at here, is it designated areas that would be set aside for green infrastructure, basically parks, canals, other types of green infrastructure within the city. And these areas were the areas designated with green dots on the map. Thus it became known as the Green Dot Map. The problem, which became very quickly people became very quickly aware of in New Orleans, was that these green dots are places where people lived. They were existing and established neighborhoods within the city of New Orleans. So after a great deal of uproar, immediate uproar, citizens mobilized very effectively against and defeated this plan. So essentially the city of New Orleans said, this is not the plan that we're going to use to redevelop New Orleans. So this map and the plan behind it then became, in fact, the catalyst that drove a bottom-up planning process. And basically from this point on in New Orleans, people organized around responding against the Green Dot Map, basically. The Green Dot Map was what we don't want to do in New Orleans. So unfortunately, what happened, so that was positive in the sense that we have a much more participatory planning process that is then at the endeavor of New Orleans. But unfortunately what happened is that in this bottom-up planning process, little was done to address the more fundamental environmental aspects of sustainability and resilience in the city of New Orleans. So the issues that the well-meaning environmental planners sought to address were more or less lost in the planning process. And environmental planning became associated with an elite definition of place that was equated with the removal of the black population from New Orleans, which is essentially the argument that people made about this plan. And John Logan at Brown University did an analysis showing that if all of these yellow areas, which are marked as moratorium until neighborhoods can prove viability, meaning no redevelopment would occur, if all of those people were not allowed to come back to the city in those areas, then 80% of the black population in New Orleans would be removed. So thus, this map became associated with an elite vision of a removal of the black population from New Orleans. As well, the tension between the social and environmental aspects of place created a very difficult context in which to think about sustainability in the city of New Orleans. So I'm interested in asking why. Why did this happen? Why did this situation come about? And I think you first have to ask what was actually disrupted when Katrina hit the city of New Orleans. What was it that was actually disrupted? And I think if you make the argument, which is which is the good argument, I think, it's place that was disrupted. The city of New Orleans, it was the place of New Orleans that was disrupted. And so you need a very clear idea of what place is, of what it is that makes place. And it's not just that houses and infrastructure were destroyed, and they were, but the social fabric of these areas was also flooded out. And the place of New Orleans was disrupted primarily because of that, because the social fabric is altered. However, what the makers of the green dot map failed to recognize is that place is fundamentally about social processes. It's fundamentally places are comprised of social processes. And the recommendations assumed that the social fabric was gone, that there was no social fabric left here, and thus place didn't exist anymore, and they could put a dot over it. But in fact, even though these people were spread out, they proved that the social connections were still there, and that even though the people that lived in these neighborhoods were all over the place, the places of those neighborhoods still existed via the social connections of these people. So what this example demonstrates for me is that the extent to which our capacity to plan for urban resilience and sustainability is dependent upon the politics of place, and properly understanding how place is constructed is absolutely essential to understanding the politics of sustainability and resilience. So my own personal research, just very quickly, what I'm interested in right now is the development of a sort of emergent form of place, which is the development of mega regions globally. Mega regions are areas where very large regions are starting to come together into one single conurbation. So you could think of the Boston-Washington corridor as an easy example of that. And my argument is that these are emergent places where we haven't given much thought to what kind of place, what kind of social process is actually being formulated within a mega region. And if this process is indicative of the challenges of urban sustainability and resilience, then that question of what kind of place is being created in mega regions is actually quite essential to questions of sustainability and resilience as these mega regions form. So thus I ask, what kinds of place politics are taking shape in order to understand the implications for urban environmental sustainability and resilience? And I'm using both sort of a geographic information system spatial analytic approach to understand how mega regions are taking shape, and more qualitative political science techniques to understand the sort of political processes that these come together with. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane. Just a reminder, these are just tasters of talks you can get later this semester and next semester if you want to hear more about these wonderful ways in which place has been mobilized for people's research. So next we have Megan Duran from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and she's our second graduate fellow. Great to have her on board.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to talk about sociology again, but from a little bit of a different perspective. So one could easily argue that all sociological inquiry has an element of our theme, right? All social relationships take place in space. But of course, not all sociological inquiry takes place seriously. In some work, it's non-existent. In others, it's merely a backdrop, an interesting ethnographic flourish, which enables thick description, or an element to be explained away as a hindrance to the goal of generalization. In a 2000 review, Thomas Guerin identifies 3 necessary and sufficient features of place for sociological inquiry: geographical location, a unique spot in the universe; material form, physicality; and investment with meaning and value. The latter is what turns space into place from Guerin's perspective. Now, I'm sure there's many ways to argue with this conceptualization of place and its relationship to space. But from this perspective of my own research, what I'm really interested in is what I see as a gaping hole in that definition, and that's temporality. The understanding that places exist in time and are constantly changing and being made and remade. So now we've arrived at a much smaller body of work when we think of sociological literature that takes time seriously as an element inseparable from place. In urban sociology, which is my main area of interest, I draw on 2 main tracks where this occurs. The first is the tradition of historically rooted urban ethnography, which can be traced back to the Chicago School and extends through some of the current work on urban political economy. These works understand the city and its social relations as historically rooted and subject to change. But I'm most interested in a second and arguably smaller line of work which reckons with place and time. The focus is not on the historical construction of place so much as on processes of memory, identity, and meaning-making in place. This literature asks, among other things, what role does memory play in the process of placemaking? How do people use memories to understand and contest the meanings of place? and what are the material impacts of such processes? So now's a good time to turn to my picture. This is now iconic image taken during Boston's violent crisis over court-ordered school desegregation that started in 1974. I mean, this picture could really be argued to be a process of placemaking in and of itself, especially we consider it was actually taken in 1976 when Boston was busy celebrating the bicentennial. My research frames Boston's school desegregation crisis as a cultural trauma, an acute crisis of social relationships of race and class that redefined the city's identity to lasting effect. The cradle of liberty suddenly became stained with intolerance. And indeed, school desegregation was a crisis of place, of territories and boundaries mapped onto power relationships developed over time. Any good historian of this era can tell you that to understand Boston's school desegregation crisis, you have to go back at least to a century to the relationships between the Irish and the WASPs, an investigation which, if you're not careful, might take you all the way back to England. You could, of course, also stay here, working your way back to revolutionary times and the Boston Massacre, an event which this picture has been said to evoke. My current journey is not to go back so much, but to move forward in time. Certainly, it would be a fruitful project to follow the historical contingencies of school desegregation, of which there are many. Space and place in the city would not be what they are today without school desegregation. And I can introduce you to many a street theorist who will draw you a direct line from school desegregation to gentrification in the city today. My interest is not, however, so much in tracking the many and variegated impacts of the school desegregation crisis, but its imprint as a memory on the city today. Specifically, how is this crisis remembered in urban politics? How does this remembering impact the construction of policy? How is it contested? How do people use this history to make sense of and act upon the city today? The Boston of today is not the Boston of 1976, and a picture such as this would be unlikely to occur. And yet, as a cultural trauma, the school desegregation crisis continues to be a reference point of making meaning in the city. Through my research, I'm interested in bringing together two often separate areas of inquiry in sociology, urban sociology, which thinks about place, and memory, which brings in time, to contribute to a sociology which takes both place and time as inseparable.
Thank you. So next, delighted to introduce my colleague in the history department, Gretchen Hefner, who is up here and talk about her picture.
I guess I'm coming back.
Well, maybe you're not. Maybe you have to.
I will. So unlike Len, I am a novice to the world of space and place. So I am sort of the test case here, and I'm going to walk you through how my thinking actually about a project has changed really in the past 2 months. So I was really introduced almost to the ideas of space and place last year from my graduate students in the history department in a really sort of critical way, rather than just sort of talking about it and hearing talks about it and going to conferences and hearing about space and place. So what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a sense of where history, the field of history, is with space and place, not much, and then sort of talk about how my own work really has been influenced by this in the past couple of months since we started this program and this fellowship. My project, just to give you a sense of it broadly, is a look at U.S. military engineers and how they're building military installations and sites in North Africa and the Mediterranean in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And I'm interested in questions of militarization, environmental manipulation, and the sort of creation of techno-scientific knowledge about the desert in particular. And that's what some of these images are about. And today, today I'll specifically talk about Libya. But let me go back to sort of where history is with space and place. And as I've been reading, we've all been reading some of these texts about space and place, it dawns on me that many historians just do this, right? They write about place and they write about space. They just don't write about it critically, and they don't really engage with any sort of critical theory or ideas about it. It's interesting that Megan mentions temporality, because this is what historians do, right? This is how they write about place, is how it changes over time. And what they don't do, in fact, is what you're saying sociologists do, which is look at this particular moment, not a pinhead exactly, like Tim said, but sort of a site where all these sort of social connections and interactions take place. And James mentioned the sort of idea of social connections. My interest is in sort of narrative interactions, how different views of and understandings of a place meet and sort of collide and reform people's views of it. And that's kind of where I'm headed with my research. When I first started thinking about this program, my project, and specifically a case study I'm doing in Libya in the late 1940s and early 1950s, I was thinking of this map. And this is this engineering map from the US Corps of Engineers. They have tons of these maps. They're amazing. They superimpose aspects of the United States on other places of the world. And so this is literally a map of the United States superimposed on Africa. So their engineers can get a sense of like, well, where would this base? Okay, this would be like in North Dakota, and this is here in Washington. I mean, this is Libya, right? This is like Tripoli, Libya. And they do this in even more detail, and they'll often superimpose maps of Africa on the desert Southwest. And so they're trying to sort of figure out how they can talk about a place in concepts they know. And that is where I really got into this story, is thinking about, okay, how are they applying knowledge of the American West to these places, perhaps in Northern Africa? But thinking about space and places actually made me dig, I think, deeper in really critical and interesting ways. Instead of just thinking about how these engineers are going over and applying knowledge they already know, kind of changing their minds and then taking that knowledge and transferring it to other places, and we see it pop up in sort of different spots around, especially the Mediterranean and Northern Africa. I'm interested in how different narratives of this place are meeting when these engineers sort of show up. I mean, it's a artificial distinction that I've decided to make, but when they sort of show up and what they do with them. And one of them, and this is what this diagram over here, sort of awkwardly behind you guys shows, or this picture, is the Italians colonized Libya in 1911. And in 1938, they start an effort of mass colonization of Libya, what they call the Fourth Shore, and they want to create an agricultural community there. And these are images they give to journalists in 1938 as part of a PR campaign. And I don't know if you can see it, but the top one is the Libyans attempting to make the desert bloom, which is camels and this sort of, the soil is terrible. It's not a very good reproduction of the image, I apologize. And then the bottom is the Italians who have oxen and a nicer plow, and the soil actually looks beautiful. It's this rich, amazing soil. And for those of us who are like, oh, of course, this is a classic sort of imperial modernization image, right? But if you dig a little deeper into it, what I'm interested in is how the Italians are narrating this place and what sort of environmental imaginary they have brought to Libya. And what the Italians will say is not only is this environment degraded and we're going to make it better, but they bring with them a story about how that environment got degraded, right? This is the sort of environmental imaginary. They see this as it was once the granary of Rome, right? This was a fertile agricultural place. The Libyans destroyed it, right? The Arab invasion, they write about this all the time. There was an Arab invasion, the Arabs destroyed it. Nomadic Arabs destroyed the land. We are going to make it bloom again. And this actually plays into to sort of my look at the engineers, because I see these engineers actually responding to these narratives in ways that I hadn't noticed before. They start talking about like old texts. They talk about Homer and the history of Libya and what this means. And what the engineers do is they're actually erasing the Italian version of we can make the desert bloom again and saying you can't actually. They bring their own sort of scientific knowledge about the environment and a concept of the environment that's emerging in the late 40s and 50s, and they say, actually, this is a terrible place. It's useless land. You can never make this productive land. We agree with the Libyans. You can never make this productive. So we're going to turn it into a military base. And this is great. And this is a logic they start to build. I mean, it's not quite that obvious, right? But it is. It actually is at certain moments. And the second piece of that for them is that they get to make a claim that they're not being like the Europeans, right? They wanted to come in and modernize you. We don't actually want to do that. We agree with you, right? Your version of the land is totally correct. And so we are just going to pay you to let us build bases here. And that's just one of the ways that some of our conversations and readings have really sort of helped me think in a different way. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. So our next speaker, we're sort of in a bit of a humanities street now, is Kathleen Quinn Kelly from the Department of English. Imagine the time and space will be radically altered here.
Okay, where do I press to go to the next one?
Oh,
Just press.
just return will do, I think. Enter.
Okay, all right, I'll start with that one. Okay, I have a title, Literature and the Place of Nature, or Vikings in My Neighborhood. And by the way, I live across the river in Cambridge. So let me begin with the first part, with a broad and obvious generalization. Humans have always represented the natural world back to themselves in imaginative ways. From prehistoric cave paintings to an Audubon print to an Ansel Adams photograph. From a simile in Homer in which he compares the rush of men in battle to a summer rainstorm, to a Mary Oliver poem about a Cape Cod beach. And scholars have pretty much always noticed, examined, and attempted to explain or interpret the different ways in which the more than human world has been represented in the arts and literature. In most of these studies, however, the natural world is reduced to metaphor, simile, metonymy, or allegory, and is seldom read for itself. And when it comes to the concepts of space and place, literary scholars tend to domesticate the natural world into landscape or setting, as sites that reveal, as cultural geographer Yi Fu Tuan says, how various and complex are the ways of human living. This is the aim of Emily's fascinating project, and actually everyone's. However, what happens when one tries to see past the humans and foreground the background? One cannot ignore humans, of course, when one tries to clear away the accretions of culture on nature. Humans have intervened and or affected every ecosystem on the planet. Moreover, we simply can't position ourselves outside of the frame of our own representations. I agree, but I think it's worth trying to do so. Sometimes for a moment, it is as if the world rearranges itself with you in it rather than outside of it. So I'm working on a book titled Lost and Invented Ecologies in Medieval Romance, in which I read medieval literary texts as witnesses to natural places that either no longer exist or have changed dramatically. A lost ecology is also an invented ecology in the sense that a human intervention in an ecosystem results in one kind of place being destroyed and another replacing it. While most ecosystems are perpetually in a state of transition between being lost and remade, the medieval period offers particularly dramatic evidence, both material and written, of lost places such as entire forests and lakes now vanished, invented places, notably the enclosed and eroticized garden, including that garden, paradise, and even hybrid natural built places, such as the ruins of Tintagel Castle and Stonehenge, both associated with Arthurian legend. I use the word ecology instead of ecosystem to indicate that I am not a naturalist studying the green world, but a literary scholar studying the history of the green world while working within Donna Haraway's concept of nature culture. Nature not in opposition to culture, but coterminous or entangled with it. Manuscripts, books, painting, tapestries, illuminations, photographs, letters, maps, and other artifacts are the necessary cultural materials through which one must work in order to attend to the agential liveliness of a given ecosystem and its history. However, my project also entails expanding the archive as traditionally understood to include Google Maps, GIS maps, geological and archaeological evidence, and earth, air, water, wood, and stone. Now let me turn to those Vikings in my neighborhood. In my final book chapter, my focus as a fellow, I consider invented in the sense of fictitious, passed off as real. I tell a tale about a few passages in medieval Icelandic literature that triggered what some call Viking madness in early 19th century North America, especially in New England. Searching from Vikings from Newfoundland to New York shaped the way the very land was perceived and lived. For example, one particular natural feature, a small kettle hole, was transformed into Leif Erikson's Thing, and that's Old Norse for meeting place. This Viking amphitheater, once yards from my house and now built over, you don't know what this feels like to be a medievalist at this is part of a larger lost and invented ecology, including 3 ponds that were drained and also built over, the one in front of my house as recently as 1953. The story of my neighborhood is a strong argument for making an effort to understand the historical and literary representations of anthropogenic change and its material and social consequences. In this case, we can trace out an all too familiar American narrative of first, the displacement of native peoples and the exploitation of natural resources, and second, of urban expansion and environmental degradation. I hope to contribute to ongoing conversations in environmental studies by taking into account not only the ways in which humans have intervened in the natural world in the past, but also the stories that they told about such interventions. These narratives continue to influence our practices today with respect to deforestation, water and air pollution, and the preservation of endangered species. Environmental historian William Cronin says, nature alone cannot explain a landscape. You need history too, and poetry. Literature matters to our understanding of the natural world and our experience of it.
Thank you, Kathleen. Our next speaker is Serena Perek, who's an associate professor of philosophy.
Thanks very much for putting together this really interesting forum. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I understand the distinction between space and place and a couple of the different manifestations of this distinction in philosophy. I tend to think of the distinction between space and place, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but as a distinction between the abstract and the concrete, the situated and the unsituated. In philosophy, I tend to think that this starts with this distinction of philosophers as knowers from a viewpoint from nowhere. So philosophy has this privileged position on truth because we see all things at once. And we have, this famous expression, the view from nowhere. And so claims to objectivity can be grounded in this standpoint. Of course, feminist philosophers, critical race theorists, others come along and say, actually, it's just a perspective. And that perspective is a limited one because it cuts off the situated knowledge that many people have by virtue of being rooted in particular places. So the abstract knowledge based on space is actually limited because it's not connected to place. So it's sort of an old debate, but something that comes up all the time is still an important insight in our understanding and knowledge and things like that. The more recent turn, I think, has to do with what's known as the field of global justice and claims around justice and morality. So, for the most part, since about the 17th century, when we talk about justice, we talk about justice within states. So states have obligations of justice to members of their country, to their fellow citizens. You and I have claims of justice to each other based on our citizenship. We have relationships with other states, but those are less based on justice and more based on security or something like that. The primary locus of justice is within states. Globalization changes that. And starting from about the 1970s, philosophers have tried to problematize the way we think about moral obligations to other people based on this territoriality. So, Peter Singer starts this debate in the 1970s when he says, look, there are people starving in Bangladesh, from the Bangladesh famines. We have plenty of material resources here. We owe people in other countries, as a matter of justice, help. And people said, no. We'll be nice. We'll give them charity if we feel like it, but if we don't, that's okay. That's fine. If you don't feel like it, don't worry about it. We don't owe them anything. So he started this debate by saying, well, in fact, we do owe them. So what can a claim to justice be grounded on, if not on citizenship? So the last 40 years of philosophy has been this increasingly intense debate over how to ground claims of justice. And now I think it's clear to most people that our well-being in a particular country is so tied to the situation of the people in other countries. Other people's lives are so tied to the decisions that we make in our countries. So it's often said that, farm subsidies in California is the reason that people are starving in Africa. And that's not a metaphor, it's an actual fact. The way countries develop policies, respond to famines, respond to their economic situations is directly connected not only to other states, but to transnational organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, the WHO, all of these which set rules which affect how individual states are able to respond to their citizens and so forth. So many people want to make a claim that we in fact have relationships of justice to people outside of our state. And I see this as the opposite turn from the previous one I described in philosophy. So we go from the particular situationness of our countries and talk about obligations of justice to each other to thinking about obligations across borders. And of course, this gets incredibly complex and difficult and much harder to understand because we experience ourselves so much as citizens and our effects of our lives as being part of our citizenship, that it's really hard to ground claims of justice to people across borders. And again, not just charity, not just security, but actually we owe people in another country something important by virtue of their humanity, by virtue of their rights, not in virtue of their citizenship. So my most recent work is on refugees. And I wanted to put this image up here because I think it illustrates this tension that I'm trying to get at. So this is a refugee camp in Jordan of Syrian refugees that just sprung up a couple of years ago. And it's in the middle of nowhere, as refugee camps often are in Africa and the Middle East. And this picture, I think, is really nice because you really, there's nothing around it. It's huge. It's a metropolis in itself, but it's not connected to anything else in any other way. Now, refugee camps in general, not this one particular in Jordan, but just in general, are really strange examples of places. So they're territorially situated, of course, as every place on earth is within a given country, in this case, Jordan. But oftentimes states rescind the sovereignty over their territory to not another state, but to a non-governmental organization, like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who will in turn give over sovereignty to a number of other local NGOs. So that technically the laws of the country are supposed to apply in the refugee camps, but the state denies responsibility for that. So you can't ever prosecute somebody from, well, you can in certain really limited situations, but they deny that laws officially apply here, but it's on the territory of this place. Some refugee camps have been there for generations, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. They aren't on maps. You couldn't find them unless you had privileged access and you were able to get permission to do research or something like that. So there are these really, I get this great example of globalized space. So who is responsible for this? Well, clearly the refugees are the responsibility of the state that made them flee. But that doesn't make any sense because the reason they fled was because the state won't take responsibility for them. The state that inhabits them, it says we won't take responsibility. They can stay there, you take care of them, they're your problem, they're not our problem. So we're not going to be responsible for them. So the West funds refugee camps. The UNHCR is almost entirely funded by countries, the European Union, Canada, the United States, with the US predominantly funding refugee camps, in part because we would like the problems to be away from our shores, not anywhere near us. So in a certain sense, we have a direct tie to it, although nobody would ever know that unless you investigated it. So who is responsible? To whom can refugees make claims of justice to? Not their state, not the state they're living in, not the international community. It really complicates, I think, the increasing moral problem of stateless people, for one, other problems in globalization, sweatshop labor, climate change, climate refugees. All of these problems can no longer be solved by appealing to the traditional bearer of justice, namely the nation state. So place no longer can stand in as the spot of justice. And thinking about justice within space as such hasn't really been theorized yet. We still don't know how to do it, and we certainly don't know how to do it in a way that people feel compelled to take seriously and say, yes, in fact, that's right, we have to do something about this. This is unjust, it's our responsibility. So we're kind of at this impasse right now, and my work, of course, is trying to progress this a little bit, but I still think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of reconceptualizing moral obligations in a time without place.
Thank you, Sabina. So last but not least, we are especially delighted to have someone from outside of the college involved in our fellowship. And this is Bert Spector, who's an associate professor of international business and strategy, but has a historical background, so he's really going to remember it.
I am the without, but I am without within because my degree is in history. My interest most recently has been in sort of doing intellectual history of the ideas of management, of business, the role of business, and even the definition of capitalism, and how they evolved in a particular period of time. So my research up till now has been focused on time, in particular what we would call the Cold War years right after World War II through the 1950s and 1960s. This picture, however, is meant to represent space, or even place, and if I can take that distinction you're drawing between space as an abstraction and place as a reality, and that is corporate America. I don't know if you recognize this particular picture, but it is a shot of a movie set that was constructed for The Apartment, Billy Wilder's The Apartment. Most of that's fake. Most of that's done with mirrors and miniatures, but it captures what I was interested in looking at, which is the fact that large-scale corporations became a reality in the United States, mainly in the post-war, say 1945 to 1960. That period of time, so there's time, saw the rise of not that these things didn't exist before World War II, but they came to dominate the economy after World War II. And I'm taking space in the Foucault sense of a community or a juxtaposition of interests. And my thinking here is that what happens when you put a lot of different people into that space is that there's a lot of certainly different interests and even competing interests and agendas occurring. And out of that grows anxiety. And that's my sort of organizing theme, is the anxious 1950s and the anxiety here being created by this, also within a larger context of anxiety over what's going on in the Soviet Union, and are they really beating us at economic development, and are they really beating us at military development? So there's a lot of sources of anxiety that occur both within that space and surrounding that space. I guess what got me interested in this is how management as an idea dealt with this kind of anxiety, and how you deal with that in terms of allowing your organization to continue to be productive and continuing to grow economically. And I got interested in looking at the role of industrial psychology, which was, I don't know if many of you know about industrial psychology. I'm learning, so I mean, I'm not an expert in it yet. But it had been around for most of the 20th century, but it was only after World War II that corporate America began to incorporate the notions of industrial psychology to try to find a way to deal with the anxiety of that this space created. I'm calling my, at least my temporary title for my piece is Architects of Adjustment. And the notion is that how you deal with this is not to change the space, not to change the juxtaposition of conflicting interests, but rather you bring in psychologists. And this is the whole, and again, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, the human relations movement, and you treat people nicely, you know, and you ask them what kind of lighting they want and stuff like that. I'm only being slightly facetious, believe me, this stuff really happened. In order to start to get people to adjust to this, both as a way of promoting the continued growth of capitalism, and the continued growth, not of any kind of capitalism, but of liberal market capitalism, and the growth of large-scale corporate America, as well as the strength and positioning of the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So I think mostly when I came into this session, I was mostly thinking about the latter, the historical time. And listening to Tim and listening to my colleagues here, I'm beginning to think that I should be spending at least equal attention. I'm not quite convinced I should be spending more attention, but at least equal attention on this kind of concept of what corporate space did to people who lived in it, and how they then dealt with it, and how industrial psychology in particular sought to find not an answer to it, but an adjustment to it. So that's what my research is going to be about. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 25 minutes for discussion, questions, and conversation, which is really the point of this sort of interdisciplinary endeavor. We're obviously meeting on a regular basis between us, so we have lots of time to ask each other questions. But we can sort of suck out from you lots of energy and ideas to take with us to our gatherings. So if you have questions, not from me, but the fellows, that would be great.
I have a question.
Yes.
Actually, I have a question for Len.
A little bit of a bowling alley.
So philosophers talk a lot about meaning. So I was really interested when you said that this is a facet of sociology as well and connected to the city, because in philosophy it's so personal and so much about sort of personal relationship to these larger transcendent beings. How is it a sociological concept? Like, how is it used in sociology?
I think primarily in two ways. So you had there's a lot of that comes out of this kind of Bavarian tradition, and his big his big book that kind of put this on the mark was the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, right? This idea that we valued something, something was meaningful to us in a way that enabled us to kind of look at economic work and kind of break it down in certain ways that basically changed work. So that tradition continues where it's like sociologists want to talk about meaning as long as it helps us to understand the economy. So, which puts us in interesting conversations with economists, right? But then there's kind of a second strain of sociology that takes meaning, and it's not just about economy, but it always has to get political. It's like, okay, well, what are we're fighting about something, right? It's typically about inequality or resources, and we just want to understand the politics of it. So how does meaning and individual meaning or group meaning kind of get tied up into different types of political action, political levers, social change? So it's either like, how do we understand the economy, or how do we understand? So maybe then we talk to political scientists into it.
I guess people want to add something. I won't be able to resist. But another thing there's another part of sociology in which meaning has been particularly important has been the ethno-methodology tradition of Jonathan Goffman, where meaning is constructed through interpersonal relationships or dramatizations of everyday life. An important part of which is setting, and setting is a huge thing in Goffman. It's backstage, front stage, all of these kinds of ways in which space impinges on the way that you perform yourself and into relations with each other to produce meaning in your everyday life, which I think is a really important sort of thing for us. Anyway. Yes.
This is just a general question for whomever. So I'm wondering about geo. I mean, that is to say, because it was the GeoHumanities, right? So you've talked about space and place, and I'm wondering whether geo as a prefix, but as a kind of attached or invented prefix, just is like a synonym for space and place, which are not, of course, synonyms for each other, or an umbrella term which includes space and place, or something else. And if it's something else, did anybody actually talk about it? Because I guess when I'm trying to think of when I think of like geography or geometry or like geo things, it has something, I'm trying to think, it has something to do with sort of distribution, right? I mean, it's not just like, oh, here's a place, or like there's some space. So I guess I wondered if people had thoughts about like what it is that geo adds, if anything.
I didn't know what to do.
What about geology?
Do you want me to answer this?
Yeah.
And I don't want to sort of. Well, geo comes from the Greek for earth. So it's geography is earth writing, geology is the study of the earth, and in that sense, its connection to GeoHumanities is interesting about how far you want to take it as about a kind of the way in which place embodies human dwelling in the earth, a relationship thing between humans and the earth. But geo, because it was in geography, I think, and because people don't do Greek and don't know that it means earth, becomes a general prefix for location, more or less. So if things are geocoded, which is what we talk about now, geocoding becomes part of something in your mobile phones and locative media where some piece of information has a spatial part to it, a locational part to it. And so that becomes, I think some of the origins of the word GeoHumanities come from the influence of these new forms of modelling, analysis and representation through GIS in particular, to sort of try and get the humanities, well, depending on how you look at it, the humanities into GIS, or GIS into the humanities. People also call it the spatial humanities. I prefer GeoHumanities, but then I'm a geographer. I don't know if anyone else had anything.
Not as someone in the GeoHumanities, but rather in this more social science, policy application side of social science. But from a spatial statistical side of this, what I always assumed the GeoHumanities meant was that they were using data that you can locate on a point of the Earth's surface by geo-Earth, but that there is something within the data that can be located somewhere on the Earth's surface, and then meaning can be derived from that location information. But I don't know if that's how the GeoHumanities use themselves.
Better than mine. Laurie?
I just have an observation that I love this, by the way. I think this is so productive and really suggestive of the limits of disciplinary boundaries and the possibilities of interdisciplinarity, and I saw so many fruitful connections, and the presentations were each fascinating. That said, one of the things I noticed is that I wonder if there's anything to do with it. There's a piece of these analyses that is about erasure. Serena, I think of, I was a little bit blown away when you said that these places are not on maps, and what the implications of that are, that they, in what realm do they exist? What do maps encode if they're able to erase places with people on them, state it, so that, and Kathleen, of course, you're all about both palimpsest and erasure, how in the movement of the earth, we lose in part the story, that stories can recover what has been erased in some ways, and then what do we do with what's recovered? And I won't rehearse it for all, but also I think with New Orleans also, you see this, how the planning effort was erased the population, and one wonders how motivated that is. So I guess I don't know what the question is, but I think there's something I want to think about in terms of the motivation of erasure, and how, the metaphor feels a little bit real to me, like you almost take an eraser and put it on the maps that tell us where and how people live and have lived, and how that changes over time.
Yeah, it's a great image, a great metaphor for thinking about things. Like, I think that's really true of refugee camps. Some of them, they could be principally on us. The reason they often are is because they're not supposed to be there. They're supposed to be temporary. They're just there for the immediate crisis, and they become these long-term settlements. They have no standings. No one knows how to talk about it. So it's just easier to pass over these things that exist in the spatial context, but they're not located in a particular place.
Can you see them through Google Maps, or are they using older images?
Yeah, I think just the official maps. When
right.
the Kenyan government puts its maps out and locates its cities and things like that. Like the refugee camps aren't there.
That's an interesting nexus of time and space there, right?
Yeah.
This depiction of space is supposed to last for some time because it's official, rather than sort of digital map that's endlessly being updated, right? Where it doesn't have to be official because it doesn't need to be there a year from now because you can have a different map by then. I'm sort of curious.
Yeah, the temporality of it.
I really like that Lori. I think about that kettle hole that I'm interested in, and I mourn its loss, that it was built over, and in part it was built over as Cambridge began to move and expand its boundaries. And I live there, and I don't feel like I'm on the boundary of Cambridge at all. But what was it? It was used for something. There were turf seats built into this kettle hole. And it may have been a Native American site, but I found no evidence that Native Americans might have ad hoc taken these natural features and used them in this way. But because this is before archaeology, and of course there's no respect for Native Americans' artifacts and what they made and what they built, it's gone. And we'll never know the story of it.
Something that just popped into my mind when you were saying that is, I was thinking about, the one way you can think that, okay, so there's erasure, right? What's the opposite of that? You've got like redundancy, stasis, kind of predictability, right? Where things are, you go to the same restaurant because you know that they have great eggplant parm, and you go there every Friday, and it's never going to change, and it's great, and that's peaceful and it's good, right? Now there's other people that say, I want to go to a different restaurant every Friday night. It's exciting. I might have some meals that are terrible, but some might be incredible, right? And if we think about kind of scaling that up, there's critics that say, what the world needs is more stasis. It needs more predictability. It needs more redundancy. And there's other people that say, what we need is more dynamism, reinvention, erasure. And erasure functions in this way to allow us to create new politics, to allow us to
describe the problem with my marriage. But
I didn't want to go there. Turn off the camera. And when you were saying this idea, I was thinking about the Situationists. They were this 1960s, 70s French kind of fun, kind of radical political planning group. Actually, might not have been the Situationists. A group called there's a group called this thing called Insta City. They said cities are boring, right? It's like you always know where work is. You always know where the good eggplant farm is. And by the very fact that we have this stasis and it's kind of, we build these buildings that regiment our lives and make them dull and boring. What life should actually look like is this series of movements. Cities should constantly be moving. We should constantly be tearing down buildings, rebuilding them. And Insta City was this blimp that would float into a group of people and just pop a bunch of city stuff out, and for like a week you'd have a city. And then it would, just fun and games and work and materials and meaning on. And then the blimp would float away and people would disband, and then they'd create a new community somewhere else. I mean, we can't do that, right? It's nuts. But it sounds fun. That sounds fun. So I was thinking about, what's the opposite of erasure?
I think
Woodstock only worked for about a day.
I think that's really interesting in terms of my project, because there's these like dueling narratives about Boston, right? And part of it is this idea of a new Boston, which has been an idea of the city since at least the 40s, right? That we're changing, we're not corrupt anymore like we were in the machine politics. And then after DSEG it was, oh, we're the new Boston now, we're not the racist Boston. And so even today, when this history comes up, there's this kind of push to say, well, we're the new, to erase it, right? This erasure. But then there's this, and the dueling narrative to that is to see this kind of continuity, right? And a lot of people, the erasure people, say, oh, you're stuck in the past, right? You want to talk about things as if they're the same, and they're not. They're different. And there's this kind of tension between seeing how things have changed and really seeing that, but also recognizing like our continuity from the past. So I think that's really interesting.
Real questions?
I have a question for Gretchen and James. I just love the story that Gretchen is going to be telling us about engineers and engineering culture, and what that might do to reproduce or perhaps shatter some of the various stereotypes we have of engineers. But you're both dealing with engineers, okay? So could you say something to each other about your engineering?
Explain them to me, please.
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, I think that this kind of, for me, what's important here is it picks up on point that Lori raised, is that in the more kind of technocratic, history of city planning and civil engineering, there is a very strong history of using maps, and I think in the context of our group, you could extend that to the use of language and images also as a tool for erasure, as a tool for saying we can now imagine this space or this place differently because we're able to sort of draw it away. And I think that lies underneath, draw it away and then draw our own map of it. And that lies underneath, I think, a lot of the sort of more technocratic approach to space and place in terms of really built upon this capacity to in fact use erasure as a tool for reimagining it.
Engineers also erase themselves often from the story. So that is one of the problems, is that they don't insert themselves the way other State Department people will in their writing. And they tend to use a certain language, though I've been reading a lot about engineering manuals and sort of conversations about what's happening to the field of engineering going from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and oh no, the sort of internal literature about what do we do and what's the best way to do something and what kind of mapping, what kind of actually drawing do you use, and oh my goodness, engineers are no longer getting this really specific training they should be getting. What is that going to do for their reputation and for what they can do? And then the training sort of changes in the 50s and 60s, and so there's a preoccupation with how that's going to influence their reputation in society. And so through that, I'm trying to figure out how it is, they're being told to use this language because this is the language, it's the way they talk to each other, right? But so how do we think about how that works underneath? I have this, sort of my side story here is that I want to write about how engineers actually see the world, or try to recreate that in some capacity, which isn't, I don't know if it will apply to the places I'm looking at here, but I'm sort of collecting the morsels of them I can find, but they do erase themselves actually from the story as much as they can. They are technocratic experts who are going to come in and do something, and that's the way it's going to be done.
I have a follow-up institutional question, and we have a really strong engineering school are important to engineers, and can we bring it to the engineers? Is it a fruitful, I don't know.
I mean, I could say I've had a lot of fruitful conversations with engineers here in the engineering department, and I would say, I mean, it's easy to draw the brush widely across the sort of technocratic approaches to redevelopment and other things, but certainly engineering has a more nuanced existence in the world.
Of course, the documents I'm looking at from the 40s and 50s, they are very specific kinds of documents, so I'm not finding them in there, so it's, and those people are no longer around for me, so I try, I look for them. But I do, anytime someone says they're an engineer, I'm like, talk to me. Tell me about how this works.
We met before and we talked about our projects briefly, but it wasn't until today that I heard so much cross-fertilization, and another word that pulls everything together is narrative, across the disciplines, and that in explicit ways, Emily and I are dealing with narratives, and which is supposed to be our work in departments of English, but everybody else is working with a narrative, and I love the film narrative, the representation of that space as well. That I just imagine that whole movie mindset creating that. Now I have to go watch the apartment.
And then read my article about it.
Yeah, I think thinking about narrative as an act of erasure is really interesting for me. So a narrative that kind of moves toward an English-only policy is a narrative of erasure, and that's sort of, I feel like those are the stakes of my project, is to kind of speak back to that erasure.
I'm right.
I have a comment for Bert. Something when you were talking about looking at that, this gives me like all kinds of high blood pressure, and I was
That's
yeah.
I mean, that is exactly the idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point.
But I was talking to a friend. She lives in San Francisco and she works at Google. And Google's one of these places where they talk about, it's like the fun work environment. Like there's a bowling alley in the office and everything. But most recently, she called me and she was like, Len, you're never gonna believe what's happening. In San Francisco, there's the Google shuttles where it's if you live in a neighborhood, you just walk to the corner and the private Google bus picks you up and drives you to the office down in the valley. And there's been all these concerns about the second that Google announces a new shuttle stop, the rents like quadruple, like within like the catchment area of that bus, because it's a benefit of working in there that you get free transportation. So all of a sudden there's like surge demand of the new hires of Google employees that want to live within that catchment area. So she calls me one day and she says, "You're not gonna believe what's happening." She's like, the protesters have chained themselves around the Google bus, in these like locked kind of PVC tubes. And it just got me thinking about how this, and this was really troubling for her, right? And she was, how this like space of anxiety of the workplace, you can't separate, in the new economy, you can't separate like this from the city anymore. It's like you're laboring in the city, you're on your laptop on the Google bus working. It's just all kind of spills in together. And so as a worker, the place of anxiety is not just here, but it's also in urban space. She was very aware of that. So I was thinking about, like how this spills over into things like domestic space at the time. So just kind of thinking about that kind of.
And I guess that's how prescient Billy Wilder was, because if you ever see the movie, that is the point of the movie.
Never seen it. Oh no, it's next to my Netflix.
Yeah. that the space, the apartment is not where he works, it's where he lives, but it's where he plays out the drama of work, because it's being used by his superiors, for rendezvous. I think that was the word they used in the 1950s. Rendezvous. And so there is no separation, and I think it's quite a prescient piece of work. And it ends. The movie ends. If we talk about narrative here, the movie ends with complete hopelessness about the state of corporate life. It's like Catch-22 in a sense. The only escape is to literally escape the corporate life. So I think he captures that. Now, obviously, the point of the psychology is not to do that. So don't worry. your friend calls you, saying they're locking hands and they're blocking it, don't worry, we'll figure it out.
I'm gonna put James in the line, get an urban planner to.
But that makes me think about the cloud and how the cloud is this no place that where everything that we all use, we can all access all the time everywhere, and
So are we more or less anxious because of that?
I think more.
That's why I'm an historian. I try to look at, I try to figure out the past.
There's a whole history of these connections, and I think that's exactly right. The way that our current workplaces are connected to our home places is an interesting story to tell. And if you go back before this period, certainly to 1920s, 1910, 1920s, up to the 1930s, when factories were being constructed along time motion study principles under Taylorism. It was exactly the same time that the ideal model kitchen was being designed for the home, where the wives could be efficient and use the least steps in the work triangle that we're all familiar with. At the same time, so these sort of ideologies of space transcend particular spaces in particular times, and they connect home and work in particular. And that boundary is being dissolved in radical ways in some people's lives, not all people's lives, but some people's lives are mostly white-collar workers and professionals now, in terms of mobile technology and how our homes work and how our workplaces work.
Where is that
But not all workers in all times and places have had boundaries. I mean, it's not as though the normative thing in some transcendent way is to have a boundary between your home and your work, right? I mean,
That was invented
in the Middle Ages, they did, I mean, they still don't in lots of places. I mean, I think it's also interesting to assume that if the boundary between home and work erodes, that must be a disaster. Like,
Yes, not necessarily. Lots of people love it. I think we need to come to an end. I wanted to say, I think this has been great. I think one of the things with interdisciplinary conversations, like this we're lucky enough to have over the next academic year, is the relationship between what your disciplinary background and your particular research project bring to the concept in question. In other words, space and place. How space and place as an idea develops from the conversations that we're having, and that you will enjoy later on in more in deeper ways with each presentation, and also what the idea brings to your research, to our research, and things that we're doing. Do the ideas take us anywhere? And hopefully that those two things will emerge, and we'll get some kind of interdisciplinary work going on there. I want to thank everybody that's been involved in this. It's been fantastic. Just to remind everybody to pick up one of these, and it has the dates on the back of the more in-depth presentations of people's research. There's 3 more events that are happening along the lines, and we're also going to have some bigger events at the end that as yet is unclear. Thank you.